Hello everyone, I'm Natalie and welcome back to my channel. So today I'm gonna continue with Erikson's theory of psychosocial development and how it relates to the houses. So today I'm going to talk about the 5th and 6th stages in his theory, and I'm going to relate them to the 7th house, the 8th house, and the 9th house in astrology. So the third quadrant of the astrological houses. So the first stage that I'm going to talk about is identity versus identity confusion. This stage is when children are faced with more adult-like roles and relationships. This is when we have to face finding out who we are and what we're about. So questions that are frequently asked during this stage are, who am I? What do I believe in? And what do I want out of life? And it is very important to experiment at this age by trying on different identities in order to fit in with the world. Eventually, we will discard the undesirable roles that we experimented with. So, if we are successful at coping with all these conflicting identities, a new sense of self emerges out of this stage. Those who aren't successful at this withdraw or lose sense of themselves among their peers. There's also something in this stage that can happen which is called identity foreclosure. And this is when an individual doesn't have any values for themselves, so they just kind of adopt their parents' values. The next stage that I'm going to talk about is intimacy versus isolation. The goal during this stage is to create lasting and meaningful relationships. However, we can enter relationships without knowing who we are fully. And those who don't engage in these relationships withdraw and become isolated. Something interesting that my teacher mentioned is that divorce during this stage, because it takes place between 20 and 30 years of age, in regards to this stage, it can be said that divorce is due to individuals seeking intimacy before fully developing their own identity. So I think that these two stages can relate to the third quadrant in astrology, because the third quadrant begins when you start to interact with other people and form relationships, because that's what the 7th house is about, which the 7th house begins this quadrant. 7th house is about your partnerships, your relationships, but it's even more than that, because it's the opposite of your ascendant, it's your descendant. So it's almost like they call it the shadow self, like your shadow side. And what astrologers or people mean by this is that it's a side of you that you're not fully connected with. You kind of need to integrate it into your personality, because your ascendant is what you know, you're familiar with it, it's kind of like the role that you take in approaching the world day to day. I think that this house can relate to the identity versus identity confusion, because you realize that you have to integrate these other parts of yourself that you are maybe out of touch with or that you hate into your identity and your personality and your role in the world. Being in relationships can bring this side out of us, and that's like the psychology of relationships. Is when we get into relationships with people, this side of us, this 7th house part of us, comes out, and we can face it more and develop it more. And I think it can develop into an identity confusion if you don't really know how to do that, how to integrate your 7th house characteristics into your own identity. I also think that this stage can relate to the 9th house, because the 9th house is like your beliefs, like your faith and higher education, but it's more like the experiences that you have that you can learn from. And you learn from them because you find some kind of meaning in them. And this develops your beliefs and your faith in the world. I think the 9th house is important because it's where we have to develop a sense of our own beliefs that are different from what we grew up with. And it can be confusing because you don't know who you are or what you believe in, so you don't know how to fully develop your 9th house. And especially going out into the world, I see the 9th house as kind of like going to college. And if you're going out into the world and you don't have a strong sense of who you are, it can result in that identity confusion in Erikson's theory because you don't create values for yourself. And people who kind of have like a stunted ninth house, maybe like malefic planets in the ninth house, can probably develop that identity foreclosure that I mentioned, where they just adopt their parents' beliefs because they don't know how to fully develop their ninth house, develop their own values and principles and beliefs and faith in the world. So I think the ninth house has a lot to do with developing your own identity, because it's about what you believe in. It's about going out into the world and feeling like you will have a purpose in the world. And intimacy versus isolation, I feel like, could go with the 7th and 8th houses. Especially the 8th house, because the 8th house is where we get deeper in relationships. It's about being committed. It's about the ups and downs that come with relationships and actually sticking through them, like sticking together and working through them. People that are 8th house dominant have stronger desires for these deep, intimate, meaningful relationships. But it can also make you very private, very hard to get to know and hard to open up in these deeper relationships. And I think a lot of people who have 8th house planets can tend to feel kind of isolated from others. Although the 8th house is like your dumping ground in regards to things that you repress, sometimes it can help to be in relationships, because just like the 7th house, this is things that will come out, things that you need to heal in order to fully develop within your birth chart. People who maybe have harder times with their 8th house can neglect doing this. So it just results in feeling isolated, feeling alone and misunderstood, and like you aren't capable of developing these lasting relationships. I also feel like this could go back to the 7th house too, because 7th house is when we start to relate with others and we seek partnerships and relationships and working with others. So people who maybe have harder times accessing their 7th house, which is your shadow self, or maybe have malefic planets in the 7th house, could have a hard time also doing this, resulting in maybe shutting themselves off from relationships or from people. So that's why I feel like these 2 stages can go with these 3 houses, because these 3 houses are really about learning about who you are and what you believe in. Sometimes we need to do this by being close with others, being in relationships, because people can mirror things that we need to get in touch with ourselves to heal, to transform, to change. We learn a lot from other people and from relationships. And I think that being in relationships helps you develop more into the person that you're supposed to be, especially for people who have stuff in these houses. But even if you don't, these houses still are important. They're important to integrate into your personality. So I hope this was interesting. Hope you like it. And thank you for watching.